Hello and welcome. I'm Real Crowd CEO Adam Hooper, and this is the Real Estate Investing for Your Future podcast. Here we explore the latest in commercial real estate trends, insights, and investment strategies that passive investors can use to build real estate portfolios that last.
All opinions expressed by Adam, Tyler, and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinion of Real Crowd. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions. To gain a better understanding of the risks associated with commercial real estate investing, please consult your advisors.
Welcome to the next episode of our special series we recorded with our friends from Urban Land Institute. This series was brought to you live from ULI's Fall Meeting in Dallas that featured over 45 sessions, 150 speakers, 240 events, and more than 5,500 members in attendance. In today's conversation, we're joined by both Christopher Ptomey, Executive Director, and Michael Spotts, the former Visiting Research Fellow of ULI's Terwilliger Center for Housing. The goal of the Terwilliger Center for Housing is to advance best practices in residential development and public policy, and to support ULI members and local communities in creating and sustaining a full spectrum of housing opportunities, particularly for low and moderate income households. Our first interview is with Christopher Ptomey to discuss the two panels he moderated from the fall meeting, Attainable Housing for All and Making Affordable Housing Work for All, Views from the Stakeholders. To learn more about Christopher and ULI's Terwilliger Center for Housing and the fall meeting, please be sure to check the show notes. With that, let's get to the conversation. Well, Christopher, thank you so much for joining us today to talk about what work ULI is doing with their Terwilliger Center for Housing and talking about housing attainability. So before we jump in, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you do with ULI?
Sure thing. I have been the executive director of ULI's Terwilliger Center for a little more than 4 years. I lead a small but mighty team of housing experts, advocates, and researchers there. And previously, I worked to help launch and lead Habitat for Humanity's U.S.-focused public policy and government relations operations. Worked with them for about a dozen years, and before that was the federal liaison for the Texas State Housing Finance Agency, which at that time was the Department of Housing and Community Affairs. And before that, spent about 5 years working in the House of Representatives. I worked for Representative Matt Collins from Georgia, and housing was one of many issues that I handled in my time on the Hill.
And so, tell us a little bit more. What does your day to day look like, and maybe what are the areas of focus for the Terwilliger Center?
Sure thing. Well, the Terwilliger Center is part of the Urban Land Institute, and we're the world's largest association of land use and real estate experts in the world. We have over 45,000 members globally. Our mission is to shape the future of the built environment for transformative impact. And ULI has identified housing attainability as a global mission priority that we're going to be focusing on over the next several years. And the Terwilliger Center is leading the U.S.-focused housing work for ULI, including its focus on attainability. The Terwilliger Center at ULI was founded in 2007 by former ULI board chair and apartment developer Ron Terwilliger, and I do make a point of saying the ULI Terwilliger Center because Ron has formed several Terwilliger Centers at different organizations focusing on different aspects of the global housing challenge. But ULI's center was formed in 2007 and initially focused on workforce housing. And at the time in 2007, that was generally interpreted to mean non-publicly subsidized housing, affordable to those earning 80 to 120% of median income. That workforce housing term has fallen a little bit out of favor with some in recent years, as most of those households that are earning less than 80% of median income are still overwhelmingly members of the workforce and have extensive housing needs. But that was the term at the time and the initial focus of the center. Over time, the Terwilliger Center's portfolio has expanded to include all of ULI's U.S.-focused housing content. And our kind of high-level goal is to identify and drive industry best practices and related public policies that enable cities to increase housing production and preservation, and in so doing, achieve better housing equity and attainability. The Terwilliger Center pursues this in several different ways. As part of our mission priority work, we're doing a lot of work directly with local members and with cities around the U.S. to overcome barriers to production and preservation, again, with an eye ultimately toward equity and attainability. We have study panels that we host in cities. It's a really effective tool that ULI uses, where we bring member experts in from all around the country into a city for 2 to 5 days to evaluate a challenge and put forth recommendations. And we've done several of these as part of our mission priority work. Recently, we did one in Boise, focused on the rapid population growth that they've seen. We did one in Brooklyn Center, Minnesota, focused on equitable investment in an aging inner ring suburb that has been underinvested and needs redevelopment. And just completed one in Sacramento, looking at some of the obsolete strip mall kind of commercial developments that have large parking lots and provide some opportunities to be transformed into walkable, transit accessible communities. And in addition to the study panel work that we're doing, we have an annual housing opportunity conference that we host. It'll be next year. It'll be in Phoenix from March 27th to 29th, and would encourage anyone interested to take a look and to join us there. And we have a research that we conduct on a variety of housing topics. We've done it on attainable home ownership in the past, on the need for family renter housing, larger renter units. We recently released a report on build to rent and that growing aspect of the market. And then we have our flagship publication, which is our Home Attainability Index Analysis and Report.
Perfect. And we'll have links in the show notes to all of those different resources. And now one thing, and when you mentioned the start of this was around kind of workforce housing and affordability. I think that word affordability is something that we're more used to when we talk about this topic. A conscious shift from affordability to attainability. Again, it's a small word change, but maybe tell us a little bit more about attainability versus affordability, right? It seems like that's more encompassing than just the financial aspect of what housing costs, and more about a bigger picture of the whole housing scenario. Is that accurate?
Well, it is, and I think to a certain degree, at a very general level, attainability and affordability can be used interchangeably. I really prefer, and frankly, at the Terwilliger Center, when we're talking about home attainability, what we're talking about are the housing choices that are available to lower and moderate income households and what they have to pay for those choices. I prefer attainability to affordability primarily because I'm trying to avoid a couple of different sets of false assumptions that people sometimes make. I think first, for people who aren't as familiar with housing and development, sometimes the term affordable housing carries some bad connotations, and people envision kind of 60s era high-rise public housing in a major city, or some of the infamous developments like Cabrini Green in Chicago, or maybe those that you saw in Mawire in Baltimore some time back. But it's been decades since that was the kind of publicly subsidized housing that's been built. And but even so, those images still kind of can feed the fires of NIMBYism and opposition to housing development, because that's what people think is going to be put into their neighborhood. So I try to avoid it with that audience, or with those audiences, for that reason, that it kind of has negative connotations. Within the industry, there's a whole separate set of assumptions, which often the assumption that if you say affordable housing, what you mean is income restricted, publicly subsidized housing. And I don't want to kind of restrict our thinking to that either. I think more and more housing attainability or affordability is a concern, not just for people at the very bottom of the income scale, but for many moderate income households as well. And so there's not above 60% of median income, there's not virtually no kind of public subsidy that's even available to help develop that kind of housing, no cash kind of subsidy anyway. So I try to avoid kind of both of those sets of assumptions by using the term attainability instead of affordability. And then when we, in our work, we do kind of try to take a broader view of it, and not just dial in on kind of average income versus average rent, or average or average home price. We know that markets are much more unique than that and operate in very different kinds of ways, and that when you kind of devolve to the averages, that you're not really capturing the picture. And so when we talk about attainability in the context of our home attainability index, for example, we're trying to give a broad view of who can afford what within a region or a market, and look more broadly again than just the average, but look at a variety of housing types that you might be interested in, of types of tenure, and what the cost is for that. So a long answer, but I think it's important. I think these are important. There's some important reasons to draw the distinction, and that I avoid the affordability term, or particularly the term affordable.
And now, how are we doing here in the U.S.? Right, I mean, we're a couple years past the beginning of the COVID crisis. We're recording this in late 2022, so we're seeing massive inflation. We've got interest rates increasing. We saw through the pandemic outrageous rental rate growth in a lot of multifamily properties around the country. Home prices spiked. Maybe we're seeing the start of a correction there. How are we doing in regards to housing attainability here in the U.S.?
The short answer is terribly.
I guess kind of
I think
question.
our most recent our most recent home attainability index actually draws on census data prior to the leading up into the pandemic, and so even before the pandemic started, we had a very, very difficult situation nationally. And our home attainability index looks at the 100 most populous MSAs, plus another dozen or so that are important to our ULI network. And so it's our larger cities by and large that we're looking at, but those are where we're seeing the most pronounced problems. I think there's nowhere in the country that's adequately or even close to adequately providing for households at the very, very low end of the income spectrum. So the extremely low income households or the very low income households, those are earning less than 50% of the median income. There's nowhere in the country that they have good choices or are able to spend a reasonable amount of their monthly income on housing. I think more and more, as I mentioned before, it's reaching higher up the income scale. We're seeing more and more people at higher incomes who are becoming cost burdened. And what we saw during the pandemic was a massive run up, not just on the price of homes, and we certainly saw an incredible run up in prices on the ownership side, but we've also seen a massive run up in rents. Today we have about half the country that's what's considered cost burdened, which is paying more than 30% of the household income on housing. And we have over a quarter of the country, of renters in the country, who are severely cost burdened. And so that means they're paying more than half of their incomes on housing. And of course, the lower you go down the income scale, the higher the impact that is of having to commit half of your income just for your housing alone. So massive, massive challenges, and not just kind of on the ownership side that's gotten all the press, where it's really impacting households and their kind of ability to live their lives is on the renter side, and we're seeing challenges there that we haven't seen for a long time. And I think we have a very long, it's going to be a very long runway to start making inroads on that at the end of the day, because all of this comes back to a housing shortage, a mismatch between supply and demand. And again, going into the pandemic, we were already looking at about a 3.9 million unit shortage is what Up for Growth has suggested in a report they released recently. And it's just gotten more difficult and more expensive to build housing through the pandemic and then post-pandemic. So it's going to be very difficult to begin to catch up, particularly in the larger cities, and it has gotten more difficult to do so with the economic challenges that we're seeing now. So it's going to be a very heavy lift to begin to address.
Well, and before we start talking about some of the areas of focus that ULI is looking at and some of the areas for opportunities there, how, with ULI being a global organization, how much of this is unique to the U.S. or is this a global challenge? And maybe are there some areas that you're seeing some brighter spots or different different components of this, or what are you seeing outside of the U.S.? Again, I think we have oftentimes kind of a myopic view of what we're seeing just here in our local regions. With ULI having a global scale and global reach, what are you seeing outside of the U.S.?
Well, I think it's in many ways hard to compare the different regions from a housing standpoint. I think you do have challenges wherever you are. I think I just saw a report today that came out that said the two most expensive cities to live in the world are New York City and Singapore, and housing is definitely a major driver of that overall cost of living in both cities. But I think because you have such different kinds of housing systems and government systems, it can be very difficult to make those comparisons. So while both of those cities have very high cost of living, obviously in Singapore, where you have a very powerful centralized government, although it's a city-state, it's still a very powerful government that controls all of the housing in the city of Singapore versus a market-based system in the U.S. where the government subsidized housing, and in New York City has some rent controls and some other pieces in place, but not nearly the kind of control that you see in Singapore. Yeah. So it's a little bit difficult to make comparisons, and I think the other thing is in a lot of places in the world, there are major housing quality challenges, particularly if you're looking at Asia. Certainly there are attainability challenges, and some of the larger cities there can be incredibly expensive places to acquire housing. You also, from a general population standpoint, have many countries in that area of the world that have a very basic housing quality challenge that has to be addressed at a level that fortunately we don't currently see in the U.S. At any rate, I think ULI has identified this as a global mission priority because no matter where you are in the world and no matter what kind of governmental system or housing development system you have, it's rare to find cities that are adequately providing the housing that their residents need at a cost that they can afford. So there is that commonality. Again, I think the solutions that you see at the end of the day are different depending on where you are. In Europe, you kind of have a middle ground with social housing between some of the heavy government controls that you see in Asia versus a more market-based system in the U.S. And you do have housing quality challenges in Europe as well as you do, but not as pronounced as you do in for the general population in many parts of Asia. So there's some similarities, but I think it's hard to generalize about the housing challenge globally. Yeah. It's unique where you are in the solution.
I guess my hope with that question was, has anybody figured it out, and what can we learn from them? But I guess it's not that easy, unfortunately. I think.
No, I mean, we do have some members who think they figured it out in Singapore, but I think that everyone who lives in Singapore wouldn't necessarily agree with that.
So, a common thread with the conversations from Fall Meeting is, a lot of these challenges, they're very large, they're very broad, they're very long-term challenges that we're trying to address. But there are some things that we can be doing in the near term, right? So maybe break down a little bit, what are some of the more near-term areas of focus or hope or initiatives that listeners can start to pay attention to or think about as they look at housing attainability, and then maybe what are some of the areas that you're hopeful for will start to have some impact here?
Absolutely. I think to a certain degree, the level of housing crisis that we've reached is giving visibility to housing in a way that it hasn't, to a level that it hasn't received in the past. And I think it's setting the stage for some cities to begin to make some real progress. And I think certainly there are many cities and states around the country that are looking for policy-based solutions. States like California, where you really have some very strong policies that have been put in place at the state level to force local government's hand in addressing the issue locally. I think Jeff Barton, who was on one of the panels that I moderated at ULI's Fall Meeting on making affordable housing work, his perspective was from Texas and from some of the policies that are being implemented locally to help incentivize the production of the housing that cities need there. So in places as different as California and Texas, you see a real understanding that there's a need for housing. And even though you have very different kinds of systems and balances of government powers in both of those places, there are strategies that are being put in place by government to help get additional housing put on the ground and to meet the gaps that exist. I think another area that I think we're seeing a lot of more opportunities on the finance side, and we're going to need a lot more ideas on that side, likely with the economic uncertainty that we're facing now. But again, from that Making Affordable Housing Work panel that I moderated at the fall meeting, Nick Caluso with Goldman Sachs and Matt Falcon with CAF funds talked about some of the opportunities that are available. Some are housing GSE supported opportunities. So Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac getting involved and providing low-cost financing and other opportunities to get some lower-cost units on the ground is really helpful, as well as opportunities that are appearing in the capital markets. And I suspect you're going to continue to see growing interest in the moderate income and lower income housing in an uncertain economic environment, because you have guaranteed low vacancy rates, and often if you have residents who are receiving vouchers or some other kind of public subsidy, you have guaranteed revenue to help pay for those units. So I expect that some of the opportunities that they were pointing out in the capital markets, we're going to continue to see grow at a time when we have economic uncertainty on the ground.
I would say, I mean, it's a similar dynamic in some of the conversations we've been having around sustainability and kind of looking forward to the future there. Of most, if not all, of real estate development is a profit-driven enterprise, right? And so when you look at some of the challenges of just the costs of, certainly as you mentioned during the pandemic, construction costs skyrocketed, land availability, zoning, all of those issues that make developing new product all the more expensive. Is that kind of at odds with attainability? I mean, how do you see, outside of some of these more creative financial products or structuring, how do we overcome that?
Well, I think at the end of the day, we have such a shortage of housing that it can that investment can look like it's distorting the market, and it may provide some distortion. But again, it's a result of an overall scarcity that we're seeing in housing. And I think at the end of the day, having more investment in housing is always going to be is always going to be a better thing. We don't have enough housing on the ground. We don't have enough financing there to get all of the housing that we need on the ground. And until we start getting close with that, I think we need to look for that additional investment and realize that kind of any distortions that it's causing are a result of the broader mismatch between supply and demand. I do think that it's cities can, at the end of the day, help ensure that they're getting the product that they want on the ground and available to the people who live there. I think that we're seeing more cities and states realizing that, first and foremost, you have to go out there and legalize the housing. Right. You have to open up your zoning and your building codes and make it possible to add density. You got to rationalize your entitlement processes. You got to streamline those processes, shorten timelines, particularly in an inflationary environment, so that developers can have reasonable expectations about how long it's going to take to get a project on the ground and what that's going to cost. And then cities can incentivize what it is that they want to achieve at the end of the day. They can provide tax incentives to get the units that they want on the ground, as well as putting requirements in place and ensuring that inclusive strategies are one way that cities are doing that. But they can put incentives in place, and developers will provide. Will create those units if they've been planned for and incentivized. And then at the end of the day, subsidies are going to have to be provided. Mm-hmm. There's just not enough subsidy in place right now to enable the development, particularly for households that are earning 30% of median income or below. There's just no way to make those units pencil, and without substantially more public investment, we're not going to be able to get those units in place, even if you're able to address the land cost and development costs and some of the other things that can enable market rate development to reach deeper. You're not going to get to that very low income.
Yeah, and you mentioned some of the studies and research you guys have been doing. One just in Sacramento about maybe repurposing, and a little preview for the Emerging Trends report. This reuse and change of use is a theme that we've certainly seen with whether it's extended stay hotels being converted into multifamily properties. How much of an opportunity do you think there is in repurposing some of these other asset classes or their uses and turning those into more of an affordable housing or attainable housing opportunity, rather than the challenges of building new product that fits within that income range?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and I think certainly with kind of the reshaping of office, we're gonna see additional opportunities coming on board there. I think there've been some creative solutions in place. Of course, it can be difficult with the floor plates of lots of office buildings to convert those, but we're seeing some really creative ideas coming forward that enable that to happen. Sometimes, of course, the redevelopment is going to have to be at the property level rather than at the building level, and but I think all of those are opportunities that are going to have to be taken advantage of, but I think there's with the challenges that we're seeing, particularly in office markets in places like Washington, D.C., you're going to have to see those properties repositioned in some way. And so I think there'll be a substantial amount of opportunity to add units, and hopefully some units affordable toward the lower end of the moderate income scale or the low income scale.
Perfect. Well, Christopher, I think that's a great spot to wrap it up. Why don't you let listeners know how they can learn more about the work that you are up to with ULI's Terwilliger Center for Housing?
Absolutely. Please visit the ULI website. It's uli.org, and you can find the Terwilliger Center there, and links to all of our research, our Housing Opportunity Conference, again, that's going to be in March in Phoenix, as well as our Home Attainability Index and other resources. So please find us online and come see us at one of ULI's events sometimes, either one of our local or national events.
Thank you, Christopher. Next, you'll hear from Michael Spotts, the former visiting research fellow of ULI's Terwilliger Center for Housing. In this interview, Michael shares insights from his 3 panels: leveraging ULI's Home Attainability Index, multi-generational living, enhancing housing in neighborhoods to meet evolving human needs, and discovering RCLCO's new Housing Momentum Index. We hope you enjoy the conversation with Michael Spotts. All right, Mike, thank you so much for spending some time with us today here. And you've been a pretty busy guy. You've got 3 different panels and presentations, so we appreciate you carving out some time to share with us.
Well, thanks for the opportunity to talk with all of you.
Tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're doing here with ULI at the fall meeting.
Hi, so I am the Senior Visiting Research Fellow for the Terwilliger Center for Housing. The Terwilliger Center is the main program at ULI that focuses on the full spectrum of housing needs, with a focus on moderate income and lower income housing opportunities. We focus not just on programs and subsidies for affordable housing, what we call capital A, capital H affordable housing, but we look more broadly. We look at sort of the broader attainability of the housing market and the ability of housing markets to reach the full spectrum of needs.
And so, visiting research fellow, what does that mean?
So I have worked. The Terwilliger Center has had a visiting research fellow for a period of time. I believe I'm either their second or third visiting research fellow, where they bring in people that have research expertise and, in some cases, an outside perspective to help inform and execute the research agenda. And the research that we do at the Terwilliger Center is very practitioner-oriented, and I call myself an applied housing policy researcher, which is what I try to do is bridge the sort of empirical literature, the understanding of best practices, and the evidence base for specific policies. And that type of research can often be very technical in nature. And we take that body of knowledge, and then we leverage ULI's member base, the practitioners, the people that are out there and doing it in the field. And then we work to speak with ULI members in the context of that evidence base, work to identify the challenges that are out there in the field, and then come up with practitioner-oriented solutions that can be implemented out in the field. So we're really
actually operationalizing what the research and the data shows.
Exactly, trying to get that sort of take things down from what can sometimes people derogatorily call the ivory tower, and try to ground that with people's experiences actually doing development practice, and trying to make that all translatable and accessible for people that are on the ground doing the work.
Good. Well, let's try to cover as much as we can in a short time here, the panels that you were on.
Sure.
So first, tell us about the Home Attainability Index and the tools that you're putting out, and how listeners might be able to take advantage of that and learn from that data.
Sure. So we knew when we started out this project that there was an appetite to use data in terms of in people's engagement work and development practice. So a lot of development practitioners, a lot of housing advocates have to go into community meetings. They have to meet with planning officials who are often volunteers. They have to meet with the financial sector. And people that are doing development work on a day-to-day basis are often familiar with data, but they don't have the time to know every single data point that's out there. So what we wanted to create is a one-stop shop that provides a snapshot of the extent to which a housing market is meeting the full range of housing needs. So we pulled together an array of 26 metrics that fall in a range of different categories: overall affordability, home ownership and rental attainability, neighborhood opportunity and access, and housing production. And we created a set of practitioner-oriented tools that anyone can access, so that they can better understand the housing challenges in the regions in which they work, and translate that information to people that are not housing experts, but may be making decisions that affect housing development writ large. And I think one of the exciting things about that tool is our occupational analysis. So we partnered with the National Housing Conference, and used their paycheck-to-paycheck data that compares real-world wages, median wages for various occupations within a region, to the real housing prices within that region. And you can calculate whether certain occupations earn enough to afford housing. And that really puts a human face on some of these attainability challenges, where you can go to an elected official and say, well, the home health aide would need to double their salary in order to afford just a modest 2-bedroom rental in our market.
Yeah, it makes it much more real, like you're saying, taking the empirical into the real world. So attainability versus affordability, we talk a lot about affordability. Can you kind of contrast? Attainability seems like that's more encompassing than just the financial aspect of it.
Well, so what we've been using attainability just because the word affordability is so loaded with different meanings. Not even, in some cases, people use it as a pejorative, but not even, it just is confused with the ability to produce subsidized, income-restricted, affordable housing. So we have worked to try and use the phrase attainability, because we want that to convey that is the broader sense, or the extent to which the broader market is providing housing choices that fit people's specific needs, but also their budget. So, it implies just, diversity of housing choice, diversity of housing in terms of typology, but also tenure, as well as price points. So we're trying to use the terminology of attainability to convey the effective functioning of a market of meeting the diversity of housing needs.
Great. And then, so what are some of the other findings when you were looking at this data that maybe didn't expect to see, or that was interesting to you when you were compiling all the data?
Right. So our Home Attainability Index focuses on long-standing durable challenges. We're using predominantly metrics that are derivative of U.S. Census Bureau data, so there's a little bit of a lag there. So what we did this year was we analyzed our data in the context of ULI's Emerging Trends in Real Estate report, which uses qualitative observations from market practitioners about real estate sentiment, about where the trajectory of markets are going. And we were looking at these emerging trends in the context of these durable challenges. And two of the main takeaways that I have is that lower wage workers struggle to find housing pretty much anywhere in the country, even the markets that are perceived to be the lowest cost. If you're a childcare worker, if you're a home health aide, if you're a nursing assistant, these are critical occupations, and they can't even afford rental housing in many of these, in almost all markets across the country, regardless of geography, market type. The second key observation that I have when I'm looking at the data is when we looked at this emerging trends data, we constantly are hearing about how the high-cost coastals are losing competitiveness because of the high cost of doing business, the high cost of housing, the high cost of living. And to an extent, that may be true. I'm not saying that that's not true. But what we're seeing that is in a lot of the markets that the people are moving to, sort of those magnet markets as emerging trend defines them, the Nashvilles, the Austins, the Atlantas, they're not producing even though they're producing a lot of housing in terms of actual numbers, when you contextualize that and compare that with household growth in those regions, those markets are actually lagging behind some of the sort of third-tier markets or fourth-tier markets. And so there's a real risk that these markets, despite their perception of being booming from a housing supply perspective, the demand is so great that they may be falling further behind, that in addition to the jobs and people migrating to the regions, affordability challenges and attainability challenges might be migrating with those jobs and people.
Interesting, and maybe that's a good tie into the RCLCO's the new Housing Momentum Index. Tell us a little bit about that. And that was another panel that you presented on.
Sure. So this was another way that we were looking to address the data limitation of the Home Attainability Index and to try and look at sort of trends over time. And we worked with RCLCO, and RCLCO, we have the methodological brains behind this, and we provided some of the applied technical expertise to develop an index that looks at the trajectories over a 10-year period among three critical elements of the housing market: housing supply growth, the diversity of the housing stock and the changes in the diversity of the housing stock over time, and rental cost burdens, which we view as kind of the canary in the coal mine for a poorly functioning market if rental cost burdens start to rise. So we looked at those three dimensions to create an index and looked at the trajectory year-on-year change over time. And we looked at it from the perspective of the concept of momentum. And so momentum, to use an analogy of an object in motion, let's just use a locomotive or a train, that is the sort of rate of acceleration, which is distinct from progress, how far you've gone, or speed, how fast you're moving. We're looking at sort of the slope of those changes over time, so that rate of acceleration, like we're increasing your speed by 10 miles per hour per second, so we're looking at things like, are you increasing to what extent is your inventory increasing on a year-on-year basis, and is that rate of increase going up or down over time? Is your housing stock rapidly accelerating to become more diverse or less diverse? And are your rental cost burdens getting better or worse, and at what rate? And so we have this concept of momentum to see which jurisdictions are really moving the needle in terms of addressing some of these critical housing challenges. And then we contextualize that with progress, because you can have a lot of momentum but not have as much progress, because you can be trending in the right direction along all these indicators, but if you're starting from a lower baseline, someone that has sort of slow and steady growth at a higher level will be making much more progress. So part of the overall data tool looks at both momentum and progress for 150 markets from across the country.
And so for investors or builders or developers out there, how can they use that data for making better decisions, right? Or is this a predictive tool? Can they gain insights about, maybe in the context of these magnet markets that you just mentioned? Are there insights in there to see maybe where some of these might be on the surface look like they're doing really great, but maybe there's some momentum here that's maybe not progressing as quickly as they could be at the surface level?
Right. So I think so. An example might be helpful in illustrating this dynamic. So you have Houston and Los Angeles. Houston, these two markets have very different market perceptions. Houston, has the build reputation. Los Angeles, not so much.
Right.
But Los Angeles is among the regions with the most momentum, and Houston is among the regions with the worst momentum.
Interesting.
And when you look at the individual components of the index, it's because Houston's inventory growth is at a higher rate, but it's a little bit it's not trending upward. It's trending upward, and so it has momentum in terms of adding inventory. But so does Los Angeles. So there's only a marginal difference there. But Houston is going in the wrong direction in terms of rental cost burdens. We're seeing an increased trajectory over time where year-on-year change in rental cost burdens where rentals are getting worse. And then in terms of housing stock diversity, Los Angeles is making more progress in or has more momentum in diversifying their housing stock.
Interesting.
So what we're seeing, what that tells us is that that's not to say that Houston is doing necessarily a worse job than Los Angeles, but it could be telling us they might be seeing some headwinds among some of these different factors, and maybe those headwinds are sort of regulatory in terms of diversifying the housing stock. I haven't taken a deep enough dive into the market to know if that's the case for sure, but it also could be just on the rental cost burden side, because that's the area where the discrepancy is largest. It's just the huge increase in demand because they are building. They're continuing to see that influx of population, and so that gaining momentum moving forward might be even more critical. Now, when we look at progress, Houston has a better progress ranking than Los Angeles does, in part because of that higher baseline. They're on an average year-to-year basis, they are making more progress in terms of their housing inventory and their housing stock diversity, a little bit less so on the rental cost burdens. But you can see that interplay where you can have more momentum, but be making less progress. And we think these are independent factors that each are relevant and tell us something different about the market.
Right.
But it's helpful to look at them in the whole totality of the context.
Yeah, and then you talk about the housing stock diversity, which, again, you're just giving me all the lead-ins here. Your final panel, which was on multi-generational living. Dan brought up in his book that he wrote recently, The Missing Middle Housing, right? Maybe talk a little bit about when you look at diversity of housing product, what are you really talking about there, and what are some of the things that you're looking forward for?
Well, if you look at, it's helpful to think of diversity of housing products in terms of the diversity of housing need, and that's like every family is different. Every household is different. And if we have a population as diverse as ours, both in terms of age, demographics, culture, income, that to think that our zoning policies, which encourage more one-size-fits-all housing solutions, is going to be adequate for meeting that diversity of needs is just misguided. So when we talk about diversity of housing choice, we talk about different typologies. The missing middle is what is most commonly which is most commonly talked about in the current national dialogue, I would say, in terms of diversifying our predominantly lower density single family neighborhoods. But we can also look at it from the other direction. Our urban cores, many of which are experiencing a lot of redevelopment, a lot of growth, but a lot of that development and redevelopment and growth is adding 1 and 2 bedroom and studio apartments. So diversifying our housing stock in those communities may look a bit different. It may be more family size units. In some cases, it may mean more variation in density in given maybe the same total number of units, but in different structural types, with variations in height. So what the diversity that is needed to be added is going to be different in every community. And so one of the takeaways from that, for policy for me, is the need for regulatory and zoning policies that encourage adaptability and evolution.
Right.
So let's not micromanage. Let's not think that we're any more prescient now than we were 20 years ago or 30 years or 40 years ago, that we can legislate the perfect mix of housing types and solutions and encourage that sort of more organic growth and change in communities.
Yeah, and not to blame everything on zoning, but you mentioned that this concept of kind of the last 50 to 70 years, like modern zoning, right? The communities and neighborhoods that were built pre that time seem to have a more diverse base of housing, and they kind of meet more the traditional communal sense of what housing is, right? So I guess how are you seeing more openness? Are you seeing a change towards more adaptive zoning? I mean, what is the temperature in that side of the world?
In fits and starts, and to tie back to our last conversation, I do think we have positive momentum.
Yeah.
But that momentum is uneven across the country, and it's almost always contentious.
Yeah.
And I think it's really born out of this housing affordability crisis.
Right.
That there's more and more occupations for which people can't afford housing. We're seeing more and more people struggling to meet the needs of an aging parent or sort of the boomerang young adults that are moving back, in part because of the housing market in some cases. So we're seeing some zoning reforms to encourage more housing type diversity in a lot of different areas, in a lot of different market typologies. Some statewide, California and Oregon have both adopted statewide ordinances that apply pretty much everywhere. And then at a municipality by municipality basis, we're seeing some progress and some momentum, but it's by no means the norm. And there's going to be a lot of, blocking and tackling that's going to need to happen to really see this happen at scale, unless state governments start getting more and more involved outside of sort of some of the more notable examples like California and Oregon.
Yeah, and one of the questions that was asked in that panel I thought was interesting was the needs of a family change over time, right? You've got the core family, you've got the elder generation that moves in at a time, you've got the kids that maybe move out, maybe they come back. There was just some interesting concepts there about how the use of a home can change over time, right? In this concept of multi-generational living. I would think, just again, my guess on this is, as a country, we're far less multi-generational than many others, right, here in America. What can we learn from other cultures that are doing more multi-generational living, and do you see that coming back into how we look at housing here in the States?
Well, I'm not an expert in international housing models, so I can't really give you a definitive answer to that question. But I think it can behoove us to look at the diaspora within our own communities. Yeah. I know that a lot of anecdotally, I live in Arlington, Virginia, which is one of the wealthiest counties in the country, and right next to Washington D.C. and a lot of housing demand. It's technically a suburban area, but in some areas we have some density that is higher than the District of Columbia itself. But there's a lot of fights over our single family neighborhoods, and one of the flashpoints is the McMansion, and so we see a lot of 900,000 square foot single family homes get torn down and replaced with 5,000 square foot homes. And what we see in some of these cases, they are accommodating multi-generations these are obviously, if you're building a house that large, they're people on the wealthier end of the income spectrum, which leaves out the issue of affordability, which is another dimension that we have to pay attention to. But even at the wealthier end of the income spectrum, we're seeing people that are part of the reason they're building such large houses is to accommodate multi-generations. And because of our single-family exclusive zoning, that just has to take the form of an enormous single-family home. But those multiple generations won't necessarily live there forever. So there's this demand for zoning flexibility. And we've heard that this is particularly important in sort of some of the wealthier diaspora communities where sort of there's more of a cultural obligation to take care of your older relatives within the family home, within the family setting, and that is can be a driver. Again, it's just I don't have data on it; it's more anecdotal. But we've heard that this is a key one of the many drivers of this sort of major home expansion trend is the need for intergenerational living, driven in part by the diaspora community. And so we need to sort of think about that as we're thinking about policy change, that people find a way to meet their needs, and this is one way it manifests itself. So if we create more options, can it manifest itself in a different way that is more affordable and sustainable on the long run? So maybe it's a zoning change that allows a duplex or a triplex or something that can flex between a single, double, or triple over the lifespan of the property, so that as people's life circumstances change, that they're able to accommodate that, and maybe provide more housing in the process.
Yeah, well, that's perfect. Again, super fascinating stuff. We can talk for hours on this, so I appreciate you sharing your time. We'll have links in the show notes for all these resources. But you can tell the listeners how they can learn more about what you're up to with ULI.
Sure. If you visit the Urban Land Institute's Terwilliger Center for Housing webpage, you'll get information about all of our research products, as well as some of the other bodies of work that the Terwilliger Center undertakes. We promote best practices and excellence through our awards programs, which we announced at this meeting, at Fall Meeting yesterday, as well as our technical assistance and advisory service panels, where we reach out to and work with communities across the country to solve real-world housing and community development challenges. And the reports for those panels are available on our website as well.
Thank you to both Christopher and Michael for joining us. Remember, you can learn more about Christopher, Michael, and the ULI's Terwilliger Center for Housing by checking the show notes. To learn more about the Urban Land Institute, head to uli.org and stay tuned for the next episode in the series.